get us started, I want to first introduce Hope Eccles. Hope and her family were really the genesis of this whole program. They came up with the idea and provided the funds for this. And I think we're now seeing people that have come to our earlier ones at other places, so we're starting to create the network that I think we were hoping to create. And I think our aspiration this year is to take it one step further and to start to think about how we can address some of the issues we see in the West as we move around from state to state. But Hope is a graduate of Stanford and a real supporter. I believe now has a daughter or a son who got accepted. A son who's been accepted at Stanford, so there's strong Stanford roots in the family. So Hope.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with all of you. And, thank you, Bruce. I don't think I was the genesis. I'm sure that was David Kennedy. But we were glad to sign on to just about anything he suggests, except maybe those 20-mile walks. This year, we're really excited about the conference because in the past, we've focused on a broader approach. And starting this year, we're trying to focus in on one specific issue, this year, healthcare. And we're seeing indication that looks like it's a really great idea. Before we get started, I just wanted to share a few thoughts about the Lane Center and my family's involvement. For those of you that don't know, the Bill Lane Center for the American West was co-founded in 2005 by David Kennedy and his colleague Richard White, and endowed by Bill Lane, who was the owner and publisher of the Sunset magazine. Bill wanted to create a premier center for teaching, research, and public education about the American West, past, present, and future. The Lane Center has certainly done this. Now, under the distinguished leadership of our good friend and one of the nation's preeminent political scientists, Bruce Payne, whom David personally recruited to become the director in 2012, the Lane Center continues to thrive. The Lane Center realizes that the wide-ranging challenges continue to face Western North America, and that strong programs and research are necessary to address, in a balanced and unbiased way, the myriad of issues affecting the future of the West and its citizens. The Lane Center is interested in everything that affects the West: arts and culture, history, economics, environment and energy, governance and public policy, water, and of course, health. The interdisciplinary approach that David and Bruce have fostered at the Lane Center advances the scholarly and public understanding of Western North America in an amazing way. As lifelong Westerners, when my family learned about the Lane Center, we were instantly intrigued. The first conference was held in our hometown in Ogden, Utah. And I have to say, my father was going to join, he's 82. He was going to join us tonight, but he had tickets to the Lion King. Our heritage and legacy, both the Eccles and my mother's Peterson family, are deeply rooted in the West. David Eccles and his family immigrated from Scotland in 1863 with little more than the clothes on their backs, while the Petersons left the relative comfort of Sweden even earlier to settle in the dry, barren valleys of central Utah. Both families helped settle communities throughout the West, making this region a home for themselves and their families. With little formal education, they rose through entrepreneurial zeal, hard work, and a keen sense of the opportunities presented. Each successive generation has tried to contribute to not only the success of the businesses and economy, but to the enhancement and preservation of the land and the community. Now, I'm delighted to welcome the Honorable David Hayes and his wife Liz. David has the unusual distinction of serving twice under two different presidents, President Clinton and President Obama, and in two different decades as the Deputy Secretary for the Department of the Interior. The federal agency with perhaps the greatest consequence for the West. In this capacity, he was the department's Chief Operating Officer, overseeing 70,000 employees, a $12 billion budget, and the department's 10 major bureaus and agencies. David focused on energy, climate change, conservation, and Indian issues during his tenure. He also had a distinguished career in the private sector as a partner at Latham & Watkins. A graduate of Notre Dame and Stanford Law School, David is currently a distinguished visiting lecturer in law at Stanford, where he teaches courses on renewable and conventional energy, wildlife trafficking, natural resources, and climate change. Over the past year, he led a successful climate change implementation project at Stanford. And among his many interests, he also serves on the advisory council of the Lane Center. It's my pleasure to introduce David Hayes.
Thanks very much. It's like the PowerPoint or the conference call start, right? The technical folks trying to figure this all out. It's great to be here. Hope, thank you for that nice introduction. Thank Randy, thank your family for all of the wonderful support for the Lane Center that you've provided. It's been great fun for me to be affiliated with the Lane Center, with the ubiquitous David Kennedy, and now his I was going to say his evil twin. I don't know why that comes to mind, Bruce Kane. But I'm mindful, first of all, that the food is right back there. There's apparently some musical entertainment, and the Oregon Ducks are playing right now, Michigan for the NCAA. So if you have to look at your smartphone here, I'm going to try to get off this stage quickly for all of these reasons. Now, I want to talk actually for the next 15 minutes or so, and I'd love to then have a question and answer if we have a little bit of time. I want to talk about the public lands. Now, I know that this is a health-oriented conference, and I know that I've got to sing for my supper, so I'm going to make some connections here between the public lands and health in the rural West. But bear with me, I'm going to go through some things first to get there. But I think you'll agree at the end that my thesis stands tall. Now, you all know how important the public lands are to the rural West. The sheer scale is phenomenal. Americans are shocked to learn that 30% of the landmass of the United States are owned and managed by the federal government, with a great tilt toward the West. In New Mexico, I was actually surprised to learn, as I looked it up today, that only 35% of the state is in federal ownership, as opposed to the 88% or whatever of Nevada, and even the 25 to 30% of California, of all places. So the sheer scale of the public lands makes it a huge player, obviously, in the West. It's not just the scale, though, obviously. The public lands are a wonderful asset for the West. More on that in a couple of minutes. But at the same time, the public lands can be the source of great consternation in the West. You know, Westerners have always had a complex relationship with the federal government. By any objective accounting, I'd say, the West has benefited greatly from the federal government, largesse, through the decades, in terms of investments, dare we say, subsidies in water, power, and yes, the use of our public lands for grazing, mining without royalties, oil and gas, etc. And it's very easy, despite this largesse, for Westerners of all stripes, from libertarians to democratic socialists, still trying to figure out who they are, but they're around, probably, they're here, right? Okay. It's easy to unite against the federal government, and as one former Western governor said to me, a Western politician never loses votes when he or she flogs the federal government. Regardless of party of that governor, regardless of party of the president, it's just too easy and too good. You do it. But there's another reason why the federal government is a villain, and it's not because it's the federal government qua government, it's because the federal government is the landlord. And as Congressman Mike Simpson recently said, a terrific congressman from Idaho, nobody ever likes their landlord. So we get to the question today, and I want to dig into that federal government as landlord piece a little bit, because there's a lot of controversy recently about the fact that the federal government owns all of this public land. And Cliven Bundy and Emmon Bundy and others are wondering, how did this happen? Surely it's not constitutional. And then some Western governors and others are pushing for the giving away of that land to the states. It's something that periodically arises every 10 or 20 years. It's now reaching some interesting flowering. And I want to take this on very briefly, but first with a history lesson, because first of all, David Kennedy is here, and we have to talk about history at some point. So here's a good point. And the reason I want to get into history a little bit is the thesis I'm going to talk about as I get to the health point is that the attitudes and values that Americans writ large and Westerners in particular have about our public lands are shifting, and shifting in important ways that actually have health consequences to the good is where I'm going. But let's get the history lesson out of the way first. When the armed occupation occurred at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, I was asked to speak at the University of Oregon Law School and sort of dug into this a little bit. Kind of, where are the public lands, what was the real genesis? And of course, it goes back actually to our founders. When the founders figured out how to put together our country, they made a conscious choice that the federal government would own land. They did it in at least three ways. Number one, of course, they put it in the Constitution itself, the property clause, which makes it clear that the federal government, it refers to property belonging to the United States and making it clear that Congress can set the terms of what's going to happen to that property that belongs to the United States. To some extent, the more interesting story, though, comes shortly after the Constitution as it begins to be implemented through the administration of the Western Territories in the 1700s. And then as the new states began to be formed across the West, marching from Kentucky and Tennessee on west, there were, for each of those new states, there were compacts essentially given, where there was an affirmative understanding that there would be public lands as part of that, owned by the federal government. But that Western Territory piece is particularly interesting. And there's a new law professor at Stanford and a historian, PhD historian as well, Greg Blatski, who has done work in this area. And he points to a lot of original research about the Western Territories. These are the areas west of Virginia, west of North Carolina, that those states gave up as part of the joining of the Union, and they fell into federal government hands. And the question was, how will they be administered? They had to be administered by the federal government. Then when states were formed, the states of Ohio, of Kentucky, of Tennessee, those states all wanted to make sure that within their borders, they controlled all of the land. And Professor Blatski says there were two circumstances that reinforced the notion that no, the federal government has to play a role in these new states. And the two reasons were, number one, the federal government was in the real estate business because the land ownership situation in those territories was extremely confusing. There were all sorts of cross claims. You had some French law, some British law, you had sort of frontier law as to who owns what, and the federal government played the arbitrator in understanding who owned what, and so the federal government got into the real estate business. But the other interesting theme that he comes up with from these early Western territories was that the federal government made a conscious decision that it needed to have land control. Why? Because of the fact that big swaths of these lands were owned by Indian tribes, were managed by Indian tribes. The tribes were sovereigns. They controlled that area, and the federal government wanted to make sure that the states did not interfere with the relationship with Indian tribes. We see that today. In any event, you know the story from there. The federal government ended up being a huge landlord for all of these reasons. The Constitution, the original Western territories, and then one by one the addition of states and the clear recognition of portions of the federal lands. It turned out also that from a policy perspective, this was a terrific way to help attract settlers to the West. And the public lands for years have been used as an attraction to the settling folks moving west. Homesteading in the late 1800s, obviously, 160-acre parcels, come on west. And then you come to a climate like this, and it didn't work so well. But thankfully, we have big swaths of land, and we'll come and graze our lands. You know, extend that 160 acres. Open up the West for mining, the mining law of 1872. Come on in, no royalties. Irrigation projects, the Reclamation Act of 1902. Coal, oil, and gas, the Mineral Leasing Act. Come on, we're going to make it easy for you. The National Forest System in the Department of Agriculture, because this is an economic driver. The National Park System, actually created in part to help the railroads bring more people to the West, to attract others in the West. The public lands for that first 100 years were catnip to settlers and to industrialists. Now, in recent years, the public land's traditional role has been shifting and expanding. And along with it, public attitudes, I think, have been shifting and expanding. Now, to be sure, some of the traditional economic drivers of our public lands are drivers today. Oil and gas development on our public lands. The U.S. Treasury pulls in about $13, $14, $15 billion a year in royalties from oil and gas and coal, in particular, on our public lands. Now some royalties coming in from renewable energy as well. The economics of grazing continue, subsidized. 155 million of the BLM's 240 million acres are open for grazing. Mining continues under the mining law of 1872. Some logging still occurs in our national forests, but here we're starting to see the change. Private foresters decided that they would rather do most of their logging on private forest lands. And while the national forests at one time were our primary source of lumber, now only 5% of our lumber comes from our national forests. And it's much more of a recreation-oriented area instead. And in addition to the fact that we still have these economic activities, I would say that, and you don't have to go far to talk to folks who work in these industries to say the way they use our public lands has changed. We have new environmental sensibilities that we now apply to the activities that we have on our public lands. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act, the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, the Outer Continental Shelf Protection Act. Now, oil and gas folks need to worry about things like sage grouse and the dune sagebrush lizard in western New Mexico. Now, some areas are not open to grazing anymore, which was Clive and Bundy's primary concern. The Gold Butte area in eastern Nevada is no place for cows, and the BLM withdrew it, and their new environmental sensibilities is the point here. At the same time that these new constraints have occurred on our public lands, a new economic force has arisen. In the last 20 to 40 years, we've seen it. It's the use of our public lands for recreation, for fishing and hunting, for hiking, for biking, for bird watching, and of course, for tourism writ large. These natural landscapes, the economics that they generate are phenomenal. And interestingly, only recently have they begun to be measured. When Ken Salazar and I started in 2009 in the Obama administration, we called together the economists of the Interior Department and said, give us some information about the economic impact of activities on our public lands. It had never been done before. The information was pulled together, and every year now there is an annual report, and it confirms that our public lands are very important to our energy sector. They are very important to folks who rely on water that is managed by the Department of the Interior. And yes, 440 million visits a year to our public lands are happening by folks interested in recreation and visitation and enjoying our great outdoors. Then the Outdoors Industry Association did something one better. And they did an economic analysis of our outdoor economy, confirming that we spend $650 billion a year as a nation on our outdoor economy. And this is largely not captured in a discrete way. It is not captured in a discrete way. And when we look at our GDP, and last fall, the Congress, on a bipartisan basis, actually passed a new law that called the Outdoor Recreation Jobs and Economic Impact Act of 2016. We're going to start not doing this by private folks estimating it, but by having the government estimate the incredible important economic benefits of the recreation economy and the conservation economy that we now have to complement the traditional economic uses of our public lands. And it's, but the economics of the, we all have in our own mind's eye, right, how this plays out, the economics, the tourism, the recreation, etc., the West as destination. But there's another piece to this economics that's extremely important, which is that the public lands and those resources that they provide to folks who want to have the benefit of being outdoors, of doing all this active lifestyle activity, that also attracts employers to the cities in the West, to the Phoenixes, to the Las Vegases, to the Albuquerques, to the Denvers, to the Salt Lake cities. Headwaters Economics came out with a report just last month that noted, that looked at the relative economic health of all of the western rural counties. And it noted that from the early 1970s to the 2010s, western rural counties with the highest share of federal lands on average had faster population, employment, and personal income growth than their peers with the lowest share of federal lands. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, and the Headwaters Economics report goes into that. But it notes, in particular, that federal lands offer recreational opportunities, natural amenities, and scenic backgrounds that stimulate migration, drawing entrepreneurs, and attracting a skilled workforce across a range of faster-growing industries. And we have, actually, further evidence of this in this room. Nancy Fund is here. She is a venture capitalist from Silicon Valley, and she, along with Patrick Von Bargen, a former chief of staff to Senator Jeff Bingaman, who's right here in the corner, have formed an organization called the Conservation for Economic Growth Coalition, which recognizes this connection between conservation and all it stands for, and the opportunities of the amenities of our public lands and business. One sentence from their website: the Conservation for Economic Growth Coalition is comprised of prominent venture capitalists and founders of fast-growing entrepreneurial companies. We believe that America's parks, monuments, and protected lands contribute to the vitality of our innovation economy. So, we have a situation here, I would argue, where we are still pulling down and utilizing the traditional uses of our public lands, which I celebrate. I celebrate the multiple use admission of our public lands. I celebrate the fact that there are some places on our public lands where it makes sense to have oil and gas development, where it makes sense to put big footprint renewable energy projects, where grazing makes sense. It's part of our culture in the West. We're doing it now in a more environmentally sound way. So there's an environmental health piece to this, number one. But number two, there's a human health piece to this too. And it's related. Number one, I don't know how many doctors there are in the room. Probably a bunch. But I'm told that there's a growing body of research that suggests that when folks have the opportunity to commune with nature, to have an active outdoor lifestyle, to breathe in that clean air, to enjoy the ambiance of the uniqueness of the West, they're healthier. And guess what? I'm also told that if they have good jobs, if they find that balance of being a venture capitalist in a Western city that can enjoy the outdoors, that also if the economics are working better, that's less stress, that's healthy too. And so it's actually no surprise to me and that recent polling shows enormous reservoir of public interest in the West in maintaining our public lands as one of the most important assets that the West has. There was a poll that came out 2 months ago from Colorado College's State of the Rockies project. It surveyed 3,000 voters in 7 western states. It was focused on questions about the new administration and questions about suggesting what these folks wanted the new administration to do in terms of managing the public lands. 68% said they want the new administration to ensure that we protect sources of clean water, our air quality, and wildlife habitat, notions that the new president himself has aligned himself with, while providing opportunities to visit and recreate on our national public lands. 80% want the new administration to keep in place monuments designated over the last decade. 62% oppose allowing oil and gas companies to purchase the right to drill in new areas on our public lands. There is deep interest in our public lands, and I am cheered by the fact that Secretary Zinke has gone on record as well, that he puts himself in this camp, recognizing that the public lands are incredibly important, and he views it as from the perspective of a sportsman in particular. Also, at an event at Stanford last fall, Governor Butch Otter of Idaho said, I want to keep the lands, public lands, in the hands of the federal government. They're managing them, they're spending more money on the wildlife budget than we ever could. And they're starting to talk to us more about how to manage our lands together and make it more of a cooperative arrangement. So there's a lot of positives here, but I think it's important to keep in mind that while we have these eruptions like we had in Malheur, while we have the rhetoric that arises from a number of quarters, there is a shared value system in the West and in America generally about the importance of public lands, bringing us back finally again to health. Good jobs and good economics are a piece of the human health picture. The public lands are doing their part with Nancy Fund's leadership and help. Check. Intact landscapes are good for environmental health. clean water comes from healthy upstream landscapes. More resiliency, which we need in an era of climate change. Healthier forests, more corridors for our wildlife, our ability to deal with invasive species. The public lands are doing their part here to help the environmental health of our landscapes, which leads to human health, check. And of course, finally, the health benefits of active outdoor lifestyles, a big driver of today's public lands, a huge economic factor in our Western economies. That's well documented, as the doctors in the room will confirm, I hope, or else I'll leave by the back door. I'm going to say check. So, as we talk about health in the rural West throughout the next few days, and I know there'll be a session on the public lands tomorrow afternoon, let's just remind ourselves that one of our most important assets to the environmental health / human health of the West are our public lands. And they require all of us to stand up for them, to cherish them, and to work through the issues that inevitably arise when conflicting interests in those lands come up, as they often do. So I'll close there. I'd be delighted to take some questions. I hope I've gotten your gastronomic juices going, if nothing else. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions. Yeah. Take a couple questions. Any questions, thoughts, comments?
Could you speak to the? Could you speak to the corridors that are being formed between Canada and the United States for wildlife?
Sure. There is, I'd say, fledgling transnational cooperation in terms of wildlife corridors. Of course, we have the two parks that cooperate together, the Glacier National Park and the Waterton Park in Canada. I'm not actually aware of much more in terms of specific corridor work that's going on between the two countries. The Western governors have been doing a lot of work in the U.S. on protecting corridors. I think it's been some of their most important work. They have done some terrific biology and mapping, identifying in particular the areas that we want to ensure that are still remaining open for the important migrating elk and other large populations. This is particularly challenging, more challenging now with climate change, because migration patterns are changing for a lot of animals. And it's another reason why I think public lands are so important, because they provide, in many cases, the only migration opportunities. But stitching them together with the private lands and the state lands is incredibly important.
You know, it almost sounded as if you were speaking November 7th. Poverty is very bad for health.
Yes.
We're looking at massive loss of health coverage. If you go up to Four Corners and try to breathe the methane that's coming in, you won't be able to breathe quite so freely on public lands. The main danger for endangered plants is climate change, and we have climate change deniers in charge of our federal government now. And you know, you speak wonderfully, but what is the reality?
Well, we're all, many of us are using our own ways of therapy here. You heard my doctor's recommendation to me. From my point of view, I'm obviously very, very concerned. The the Interior Department's role in climate change is incredibly important on both the energy side and then on the impact side. On the energy side, I have my fingers crossed that the methane venting and flaring rule that we finalized last fall will not be overturned by the Senate. It's very, very close. But this is just common sense stuff. In fact, the whole rationale for limiting the methane releases from the oil and gas wells on our public lands is that this methane is being wasted. This is a natural resource for which royalties should be collected. We all own that methane. And in North Dakota and other areas where the oil is more valuable and they don't have the infrastructure yet for the natural gas, they just vent it. You can see North Dakota from space because of the flaring that's occurring. Much of it, at least a good percentage of it in New Mexico is on public lands. And then on the impact side, in Alaska, the erosion that's occurring, there are native Alaskan villages that are needing to relocate now because the sea ice has gone out. The Arctic Sea pounds. USGS has done 30 meters a year in some cases. Up in Shishmarev and other towns we're having longer and harder droughts. We're having extreme weather events with flooding. We're having more invasive species. We're having tremendous tree death because of the beetle population that doesn't get frozen out in the cold weather that's not there. I can go on and on and on. I'm very concerned. I am heartened. I just look for bright spots where I can, okay? I'm heartened by Secretary Zinke's interest in the public lands and his sincere stewardship sense. I am very concerned that we may not have a balance on some of these other issues we're talking about. But we live in a democracy, and I'm happy about that. And we'll have a chance to speak our minds in that respect in the weeks and months ahead and in the Novembers ahead.
Questions? Over here.
What can be done to preserve the EPA and to prevent the overturning of acts such as the Endangered Species Act? Is there anything we can do?
Well, yes. I'll get to what you can do in a second. I think the environmental ethic is alive and well in our country, and including in the Republican Party, which traditionally has been, of course, very good on conservation issues. And when push comes to shove, there is at least blocking power, I think, in the Congress on the Endangered Species Act, for example. I don't know if Jeff Bingman would agree with me or not. I mean, he's been through some times when there have been some pretty tight squeezes on things like the Endangered Species Act. And so I think our fundamental environmental laws are not necessarily threatened. But as we all know, those laws really just set the direction, and the agencies need to have the authority and have the obligation to then fill it out. And I'm very worried about what this EPA will do in terms of taking away the resources needed to implement the laws and, of course, undermining some of the regulations. What can you do? Just be active and tell and let. I personally cheered about the activism that we're seeing and the reaction to some of the environmental actions that are being taken. Look, the Tea Party took this route and very successfully got the Freedom Caucus into office, and that's quite relevant today, in fact, this very day. So there's no reason why activists on other issues can't can't do the same thing. Boy, I feel like I've turned this into a political thing. Rita, help me out. Final question. I know.
David, my question is, your focus has been very much top-down. What does the federal government do to manage public lands? But each of these public lands you're talking about are in states.
Yep.
Would you agree that the states can be the incubator for some of the best ideas out there for managing the environment?
I'm glad you asked the question, and let me say that Rita Pearson McGuire and I, on other side, Rita with Senator John Kyle, and me with Secretary Bruce Babbitt, did some great things in Arizona water together in the 1990s, and I cherish that. Here's the other story that I want to tell very briefly. And I'm glad you're asking the question, because this shouldn't sound top-down. I'm sorry it did. The reality is these public lands have to be managed with a lot of input from local communities. And the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge situation was instructive, because the Fish and Wildlife Service had just finished, about a year before, literally a 6 to 8 year dialogue with that community of Burns about how that wildlife refuge should be managed under the resource management plan that would then follow for the next 10 or 15 years. And that's why the Bundy crowd really didn't get much warmth in the town of Burns, because that population knew what the refuge was all about. There were neighbors there working at the refuge. They endorsed the work of the refuge, etc. And then my confirmation was held up for 3 months by Senator Bennett in Utah, because Ken Salazar had struck down 77 oil and gas leases in Utah that had not been quite completed at the end of the Bush administration, some of which were on the doorstep of Arches National Park, Canyonlands National Park. That didn't make sense to have them there. What's happened now is the Moab area has had an extensive master leasing plan process with a lot of public participation. It's 8 years later, but it came out last year. They figured out where and how in that whole southeastern Utah area to drill for oil and gas and to set aside for recreation. You have literally 1 million folks coming to Moab every year for outdoor recreation. So that is the other piece of it. And Zinke has talked about that too, and I agree with him. He says we need to do better in terms of actually managing these units with a sensitivity for the folks. But those 70,000 employees of the Department of the Interior, there are only 2,000 in Washington, D.C. They're all here. They're in the West. Now, I don't think it's a good idea to have the department headquartered in the West, like Jeb Bush suggested, but the people are here, and they need to be heard. And I hope there's more of that. And it's another hope for Zinke that he will continue to improve those processes. All right, now it's time to eat or something, right? Thank you very much.